It's 5 years since the Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi was killed. How can his country emerge from the chaos and violence that has followed his death? And we ask whether technology can find ways of improving the misery of air travel. I'm Shuli Ghosh. This is Insight. Hello there and welcome to Insight. Muammar Gaddafi died exactly 5 years ago. The former Libyan leader was pulled from a drainage pipe and shot by his own people. It was the culmination of a military intervention in the North African country by British, French and US forces to remove him from power. But half a decade later, Libya is in chaos. Armed factions are battling for control. There's no clear governance and Daesh have flourished. Insight's Dana Lewis reports on the foreign policy failures that turned Libya into a failed state.
Around the coastal city of Sirte, pro-government Libyan forces locked in a ferocious battle against dug-in Daesh fighters. They are said to be close to liberating the city in street by street, house by house fighting. Libyan troops are backed up by American, British, French, and Italian forces. They have returned to Libya to finish what they started 5 years ago.
I think it's complete chaos. It's a mess that could have been avoided.
The problem was then, of course, having intervened, intervention sets off a process that is almost unstoppable.
In 2011, rebels in Libya's Arab Spring called on the West to support them. They rose up against Muammar Gaddafi. Britain and France led the charge from the air. America reluctantly joined in. Western air power was used to destroy Gaddafi's armor on the ground, which threatened to crush a rebellion largely centered in the city of Benghazi. Today, observers disagree on how large a threat to civilians actually existed.
It's clear to me, with the benefit of hindsight, that it wasn't a purely humanitarian intervention that motivated them to do what they did.
What was it?
It was probably a desire to win some sort of approval internally and domestically with the voters.
We beat ourselves up by not intervening, and then we beat ourselves up when we intervene. And the problem that we've had is not military intervention as such, but military intervention of the wrong sort, which is not then backed up by proper civilian thinking and backed up by all the things that go along with intervening in a foreign country.
Former British Prime Minister David Cameron still contends that the bombing of Libya and the removal of Muammar Gaddafi was, quote, the right thing to do. And he says at least Britain and France didn't get sucked into putting boots on the ground and into a bloody occupation. Besides, the UN supported intervention at the time, justified by the need to protect civilians.
Disagreement over whether the West should have intervened 5 years ago, but widespread agreement that it failed to follow up. U.S. Ambassador Christopher Stevens was killed in Benghazi by terrorists in 2012. President Obama said Libya was his worst mistake in office, not planning for the day after the regime had fallen. Rival militias have fought endlessly since Gaddafi was killed. The country is almost broke and oil wells not pumping anywhere near capacity. And Libya is virtually divided, with a UN-sponsored government in Tripoli and in the east General Khalifa Haftar, who lived in the US for 20 years and was supported by the CIA. He refuses to cooperate with the new Libyan government and sees himself as the country's savior. Again, disagreement over whether Libyans can mend political divides.
Libya will always be factionalized between East and West. I mean, it was during the period of the Roman Empire. There was a separate East and a separate West. That's Libya's job to live with. But I think that we can work with a reasonably enough central government in Tripoli to actually create some form of national unity.
You still have a country that is split in two, and you still have people holding out against this attempt to reconcile the two sides. The chances for the peace process to succeed are extremely low at the moment. And the reality, again, on the ground is a reality of war, military conflict, and social tension.
A country split in two and now three. Another group has seized control of some government buildings in Tripoli, declaring the UN-backed government illegitimate. It's currently an armed standoff. A failed Libya is a breeding ground for terrorism, and amid the chaos, thousands of refugees have used Libya as an embarkation point for their trip across the Mediterranean Sea to Europe. The West is now keen to see Libya succeed. I'm Dana Lewis, reporting for Insight.
Well, to discuss this further, I'm joined by Yasmin Qureshi, a Member of Parliament who is the Shadow Justice Minister and also part of the Foreign Affairs Committee which recently examined the Libyan intervention, and also Rofna Begum, who is a women's rights researcher on the Middle East and North Africa at the international advocacy organisation Human Rights Watch. Ladies, good to have you with me in the studio. Yasmin, let me start with you, because the MP's report back in September was a damning indictment of David Cameron's Libya policy. But at the time the decision was made to intervene in Libya back in 2011, the overwhelming majority of MPs voted to back it. You were one of the very few who opposed it.
That's right, and there was 8 others as well, because basically we felt that the intervention was going to be wrong, that it wasn't going to work out properly, that they were going to leave a big vacuum there, that it would allow all sorts of militant militias, armed revolutionary groups to operate. When you don't have a strong state who can look after the security of the nation, which you had with Gaddafi and the previous Libya government, because whatever you might think about their human rights issues or whatever, Gaddafi in Libya was a stable country. It was able to deal with violences, it was able to deal with security issues. By getting rid of them, you left a complete vacuum.
So you agree with the conclusion that there was no clear Libyan policy, and in fact the policy seemed to change from democracy to a new regime?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things I mentioned in my speech was that the UN resolution apparently said that any methods you can use to deal with this. And I said then that I was fearful that we'll have probably ground on the troops on the ground, and the issue about it becoming a regime change. I mean, it started with sort of like helping the people, and then it became a regime change. And some of us were very concerned about that. And as far as I'm concerned, and I said in my speech, and also we heard evidence in our Foreign Affairs Select Committee, that this was very much Sarkozy-led, French-led initiative, and Cameron kind of tagged along because the French were losing influence in North Africa, in Libya, and this was their way of trying to regain their position and strength in Libya.
But at the time, the intervention was done on humanitarian grounds. Rofna, what is the humanitarian situation now?
Currently, Libya is a complete mess. And when you look at the situation for women, they've been sacrificed since before 2011, during the Gaddafi era, since 2011, in the post-Gaddafi era. We found that women's rights have constantly been sacrificed. They've been failed time and time again. One of the biggest issues was during the 2011 period, when women were part of the uprising. They were there, they wanted to fight for their rights, and there was an opportunity as well that was presented when there was the constitution was up for change as well. And what we found was at a time when women were fighting for discriminatory laws that were present under Gaddafi's regime, and also a constitution that did not uphold women's rights in completely.
But the argument that the intervention was justified by the fact that under Gaddafi there had been crackdowns on any kind of dissent, public hangings, disappearances, executions, purges. Those things, I mean, are we saying that it's worse now, or was it worse then?
Unfortunately, the situation is just as bad. So we've got a situation where militia groups have taken over vast swaths of Libya. We've got ISIS in several parts of Libya as well. Women's rights have increased in terms of their restrictions and their violations. So we've documented abuses by ISIS in Sirte, where they were last holding a huge amount of time. And women were facing incredibly restrictive clothing restrictions and access to their movement. So women were facing, for instance, very thick, loose abayas that they would have to cover from head to toe, including their faces, their hands, and even their feet. And their male relatives would be fined or flogged if they were found to be breaching it. So girls as young as 10 or 11 were being forced to cover because their mothers were worried that their husbands or their brothers would be fined and flogged as a result.
So 5 years on, lone voices are now looking back and saying, actually, Gaddafi was someone who could control Libya. He was a strong leader who could bring all the factions together and keep it stable.
Absolutely right. I mean, now everybody talks about all the crises on the sea, the migrants coming. Well, that wouldn't have happened if Gaddafi was still in control, because there would have been border patrols, proper patrolling, proper security taking place. So all of these sort of things, what some of us mentioned, we said this would happen. And of course, what we did is same again, is Iraq, right? You get rid of a strong government, you leave nothing in its place. So what do? You get a whole lot of armed revolutionaries, a whole lot of gangsters, criminal gangs, all sorts of people operating. And again, the UN, the international community, had no after plan, no plan to actually what to do once you've got rid of the government there. So that was a big chronic failure, and that's one of the things we said. So now what we've got to do is really the international community has got to step up, has got to get all the different warring factions to get together and actually start governing Libya properly.
Well, I mean, in terms of governance, there is a very weak government. I mean, there were two competing ones at one point. In terms of human rights now, there is no one to be held accountable, is there? So when you're talking about all these things that women and girls are going through and the problems of Daesh, no one is being held to account for what's happening in Libya.
The militia groups can still be held to account. International justice is there for a reason. But we've got an ongoing ICC investigation where the ICC is trying to call on the participation of the Libyan authorities and those in control for Gaddafi's sons, for instance, to account for the crimes that they took place before. But that's still precarious right now. We've also got a situation where militias continue to have complete impunity right now, where they continue to have, they can have ongoing abuses and they are not held to account for it. But in the future, we could see a situation where they are brought to account. The problem is what level of support there is right now by the international community. We've seen for the last 4 or 5 years the failure for the international community to provide support, adequate machinery and so on, in order to ensure that the institutions in power were there in order to help become centralized, in order to deal with the militias, for instance, and not to provide the vacuum that became the grounds for where women's rights are now completely sacrificed.
All these governments would argue that Europe and the UK and the US would say, we've put millions into Libya. We've put millions into Libya trying to rebuild it, trying to prop up the government, trying to restructure.
No, they didn't, and they had no after plan for it. What they're trying to do is a mishmash of policies, and somebody's doing something, and other bits are doing different things. There was no systematic plan. There was no after plan. Same with what happened in Iraq, same in Libya, because the international community are all gang-ho going into countries, but don't care about what was going to happen in the aftermath. There was no plans done, and nothing was put into place. And even now, there hasn't been a strong will by the international community to sort things out. For some, it's quite useful.
At the end of the day, I mean, we always talk about the international community having to come in and solve all the problems. Isn't it up to the Libyan people to do some of the work? And at the moment, they have all these different factions who are refusing to lay down their weapons, who are refusing to work together. How do you bring order to a country that won't even bring order to itself?
Well, this is where when you talk about international community, because they're the ones who went in and bombed the place down, so they owe responsibility to the people in Libya to have an after plan for the country. And that's where they fault lie. They should have got the main people. They should have actually, before they planned all this, they should have got groups of people in place to take control of things, because they just leave the place completely lawless. And therefore, that's where their responsibility is, to try to bring all the different factions together.
What they're trying to do. I mean, what do you think about that? There is the Government of National Accord, which is backed by the UN. Much good that seems to be doing.
Unfortunately, that has very little power and control over their area. They have to actually engage with those who do have the power and do have the effective control in order to actually bring the two sides together. Right now, you've got a situation where time and time again, women's rights are being failed, the people of Libya are being failed. We've had situations where women's rights defenders who were trying to reform what's happening in the country, who were trying to bring all these people together, were being denied their space, and this vacuum was therefore created. So right now, what we need to do is the international community, whether it's the US, the UK, France, those who have been involved in the situation for Libya, get together right now, prioritize the situation for Libya, because there have been other countries around the world that have taken away the attention from Libya, which is in itself a mess.
What kind of voice do women have in Libya right now?
practically nothing. We've got a situation where at one point women were pushing for change, but all those women's rights defenders are now either completely outside of Libya or harassed and intimidated, so they cannot actually present their viewpoints. One of the peak moments in Libya that was incredible failing was when Salwa Boughairis, a former National Transitional Council member and a lawyer, a prominent women's rights defender and champion, was shot in her own home in 2014. And that was a pinnacle of what was happening to women's rights and to women's rights activism in the country.
Okay, I'm going to ask both of you very quickly because we are running out of time. Obviously, the focus now is on the operation to get rid of Daesh from Sirte in Libya. What needs to happen after that?
Right. We need to get rid of ISIS and also other militias and military groups in Libya. They need to bang heads together, literally, and get people together to form a proper government.
Okay.
And start running Libya.
And in terms of human rights, what do they need to do?
They need to have quite a clear plan in place to ensure that there's not a vacuum and that there aren't other militia groups that are taking over these places without adequate consultation. So the Libyan people, women and men, are actually consulted about what's supposed to happen in their towns and their cities.
Ladies, thank you very much indeed for that. It was a great discussion, Yasmin Qureshi and Rothna Begum. You're watching Insight. Coming up, we'll be taking a look at aviation technology. How far will it take us? That's after the break.